What's up, guys? Welcome back to my channel. It is another rainy day here in New York. It is dark, gloomy, and honestly, it matches the mood of what Cassie's been saying in court. So the prosecutor picked up right where they left off yesterday, and Cassie is back on the stand. And she is expected to testify for up to 4 days total. So this video is just the raw transcript, exactly what was said in court. And I know that some people prefer that over a summary. I am the same way. So that is what I am doing. Later, I'm planning to make a video going over everything Cassie said during her testimony. It's a lot, okay? It is a lot, you guys. So I'm thinking I might just put it all into one video instead of breaking it up into parts. I don't know, but we'll see, okay? We will see, but let's get started. All right. The judge says, we have a note from a juror about a scheduling accommodation. It's not in the docket. What about Ms. Ventura's husband? The prosecutor says, remember, her name is Johnson. So like I did yesterday, I'm going to refer her as Johnson. So when I say Johnson, know that that is the prosecutor, okay? So Johnson says he will be removed from the courtroom before a certain issue comes up. The judge says, good. The judge says, have the privacy screens been installed? Johnson says they are being installed by court tech staff. The judge says, on the conferring with the counsel issue, I tend to agree with Ms. Shapiro. Johnson says, what about conferring about questions about privilege? Then Diddy's attorney, Shapiro, says, I'm concerned that during the break, there could be generalized discussion about the testimony and might come up. We are going to try to avoid any privilege communications. Johnson says, during Mr. Phillips' testimony, I spoke with his lawyer. Johnson says, we anticipate these witnesses being on cross-examination for multiple days. We need to speak with them about security and transportation. Judge says, Ms. Shapiro, can you draft something on a piece of paper, an instruction you would have me give? Then Johnson says, the defense has sent us a zip file of text messages. We are reviewing them before raising it. The judge says, I appreciate that. Then the prosecutor, Comey, says, the defense has still not shown U.S. exhibits they may use in cross-examination of Ms. Ventura. We are worried this will continue. And then Diddy's lawyer, Estavajo, says, we are making several chains of text messages. They had these documents in their possession for 8 months before we got them. The judge says, we are here. We were told there's half a day left of direct. Could you give them at lunch? Then the defense says our legal is printing them out. Then Comey says they should have turned over these exhibits to us on April 27th. The judge says, Ms. Garagos, we did have a schedule. As you marked them, why shouldn't you be required to turn them over? Then Diddy's lawyer, Mark Agnifilo, says Rule 16 does not contemplate these carve-outs. We are not behind the 8 ball on this. We have complied with Rule 16. I would be surprised if the government only has another 3 hours with Ms. Ventura, but whatever. Mark Agnifilo continues, we don't think it's required, but we'll do it. Luckily, we have a sizable defense team, so we can do it. The judge says, Ms. Comey, what do you want? Ms. Comey says, we want their exhibits, not a trial by ambush. I want them now. I will find the cases. The judge says, you don't have to put in a letter. You can just email me the cases and I'll take a look at them. City Press would ask, are they judicial documents going to go into the public docket? How much is being left off the docket in this case? The judge says, we have a witness waiting in the back. Produce them before the cross-examination starts. You can email me cases during the trial day. Let's get moving. Let's get Miss Ventura back. Cassie enters the room. The judge says, welcome back. The judge says, all rise. Jurors enter the room. The judge says, you are still under oath. Proceed. Johnson says, may I approach the witness? The judge says, you may. Johnson says, Ms. Ventura, I just handed you 2 drives. What is on them? GX8. Cassie says, messages and photos from my devices. Johnson says, yesterday you testify about Sean going armed to look for Suge Knight. Cassie says Sean took guns with him. Johnson says, and he told you to ask the escorts if they were cops. Cassie says, I would. Began by saying I was not a cop. Johnson says, Sean told you to do that? Cassie says, yes. Johnson says, what happened when you fought back? Cassie says, I did that more earlier in the relationship. It would make him more violent, want to push me harder. Then the defense says, objection to the speculation. The judge says, overrule. Johnson says, how would Sean react if you fought back? Cassie says, anger. Johnson says, I'm going to show you the LA Intercontinental Hallway again. Play from 1 minute 43 seconds to 1 minute 46 seconds. Johnson says, who enters? Cassie says, Sean. Johnson says, what's in his hand? Cassie says, he doesn't appear to have anything. Johnson says, play to 1:59. 1 minute 59 seconds. Now, anything in his hand? Cassie says, my phone. Johnson says, how did he get it? Cassie says, well, he took all of my stuff. Johnson says, where does he end up? Cassie says, sitting in a chair in front of the window. Johnson says, what are you doing? Cassie says, I'm walking away from him. Johnson says, now who's in the video? Cassie says, me and security. Johnson says, in this one, play from 5 minutes and 31 seconds. Where did you go from the hotel? Cassie says, to my house. I took an Uber. Johnson says, now let's turn to text messages. Can you read 4? Cassie says, please call, I'm surrounded. Johnson says, who sent that? Cassie says, it's from Sean. He was running around in a towel. I told him to put the robe on. Johnson says, who sent these green messages? Cassie says, I did. I wrote to Sean. Jules left. As long as you are quiet, you can stay. Peace. Johnson says, who was Jules? Cassie said, an escort. Johnson says, is this Jules? They showed a photo of Jules with a big smile. Cassie says, yes. Johnson says, B606 and 607 side by side. Cassie and big sunglasses. Cassie says, that's me. A selfie of me with a fat lip. Johnson says, when did you take it? Cassie says, in an Uber with one of my phones. Johnson says, what did you write here? Cassie says, I said, please stay away from me. Johnson says, and what does he say? Cassie says, he says, I'm getting arrested. Johnson says, was he? Cassie says, I don't think so. Johnson says, what did you write back? Cassie says, plugging my phone in. I'm going to bed. Johnson says, who was at your home when you got there? Cassie says, Carrie Morgan. She was upset when she saw me. She called the police. Johnson says, did you speak with them? Cassie says, yes, but I didn't say who I was talking about, and they left. Johnson says, why? Cassie says, I wasn't ready. Johnson says, did Sean try to come to your apartment? Cassie says, yes. He was banging on the door. That was pretty normal for him. But this is a pretty private building. Johnson says, did you hear from Miss Christina Coran that day? Cassie says, yes, and I went to see D-ROC and his wife to try to feel safe. Johnson says, in this photo, what are you wearing? Cassie says a gown and sunglasses. I had a black eye. Johnson says, what if any other bruising was visible? Cassie says, I had several bruises on my leg, but I changed clothes. Johnson says, what is this? Cassie says, me and Sean at the after party. Johnson says, I'm going to show you escorts. Do you know the name of this person? Cassie says, no. Johnson says, in what cities do you see him? Cassie says, New York. Johnson says, who is this? Cassie says, Islander. He was on Latin Men. We used him in LA and maybe Vegas. Johnson says, who is this? 2A-616. Cassie says, we called him Tommy. Johnson says, who is this? Cassie says, I know him as Greg, an escort in Miami. Johnson says, who is this? Cassie says, Jonathan. We saw him in Miami. Oh, this could be Jonathan Alder, you guys. Johnson says, who is this? Red baseball cap, backwards. Cassie says, I don't know. He looks familiar from the freak-offs. Johnson says, what did you write here? Cassie says, this is all we do. I'm just getting back on track. Maybe you can call Kim or something. Johnson says, what did you mean by this is all we do? Cassie says, freak-offs is all we do. Johnson says, did you try to avoid anything in the freak-offs? Cassie says, I tried to avoid kissing. It seems too intimate. But Sean told me to do it, to kiss the escorts. Johnson says, what did Sean ask you to do on your 29th birthday? Cassie says, a freak-off. Cassie says, he had me pull out of the blind dragging for the freak-off with some security. Johnson says, what about blackmail material? Cassie says, he wanted me to fear. Then the defense cut them off and says, objection. The judge says, overrule. Johnson says, when would Sean mention the freak-off videos? Cassie says, when he wants to hurt me. Cassie says, one time I was dating someone else and he threatened to release the freak-off videos. I would have to answer to my mother. It's horrible and disgusting. No one should do that to anyone. Johnson says, what did Sean say the impact would be? Cassie says, shame. Johnson says, let me show you a chat. Who's on it? Cassie says, me and Sean, July 22, 2013. Johnson says, read your message. Cassie says, I wrote, please delete the videos off your phone. Too many people have access to your devices. He said, no, my iCloud is all good. The Ambien is kicking in. Johnson says, sidebar? The judge says yes. So at 11:10 a.m. Eastern, the judge has taken a break to change some things in the courtroom. During the break, Diddy sit at the defense table. His lawyer, Xavier Donaldson, was leaning down to speak with him. So Johnson says there's still some issue with the privacy screens, so we'll put that off and do something else now. The judge says, okay, welcome back, Ms. Ventura. Bring in the jury. The jury enters. Johnson says, I offer more exhibits. Johnson says, what did you say here? Cassie says, I've been told there was a sexually explicit video out there about me. I reached out to Sean. Johnson says, then what? Cassie says, we were driving back to NYC from Atlantic City to talk to this DJ Woo Kid. Johnson says, did that happen? Cassie says, at a restaurant. Johnson says, what was security's role? Cassie says, to intimidate. They were lining the room. Johnson says, who was there? Cassie says, Uncle Paulie and James Cruz. Johnson says, how would you recover from a freak-off? Cassie says, I would take opiates. I wanted to feel numb. We would get massages, IV fluids. The chef would cook us something. Johnson says, how often did you take opiates after freak-offs? Cassie says, often. I got urinary tract infections. Johnson says, were the UTIs painful? Cassie says, yes, very painful. Antibacterials did not work anymore. Johnson says, how did it feel during freak-offs? Cassie says, burning. I would not advise it. Johnson says, let's read this out loud. Cassie says, reading, I have all these sores on my tongue. I have another UTI. Johnson says, what sores? Cassie says, friction in my mouth. Johnson says, from what? Cassie says, oral sex. Johnson says, you said another UTI, then sad face emoji. Cassie says, I was open with him about them. Johnson says, reading Sean's text, so you feel sick? I'm sorry. Cassie says, why are you sorry? I took the blame for things. Johnson says, which escort would you go to sex clubs with, you and Sean? Cassie says, Jules. Johnson says, the escort from the Intercontinental in LA? Cassie says, yes. Johnson says, did you want to have sex with Jules ever? Cassie laughs and said, no, but I knew him. Johnson says, why did you do it? Cassie says, because of Sean. Johnson says, who was present when Sean put his hands on you at these freakouts? Cassie says, sometimes the escort was there too. Johnson says, in the same room? Cassie says, yes, Jules. Johnson says, and in the suite? Cassie says, yes. Johnson says, were they aware? The defense says, objection. The judge says, overrule. Cassie says, yes. Cassie says, the escorts would ask me if I was okay afterward. Johnson says, in what cities did he put his hands on you? Cassie says, New York, LA, Miami. Johnson says, how frequently? Cassie says, too frequently. Johnson says, what's the Abbey? Cassie says, a gay club in LA. I went there with my friend. Johnson says, where were you going? Cassie says, to a music festival in Canada run by Drake. Sean came to my home and tried to attack me. I was thrown into the bed frame. Johnson says, what is this? Cassie says, a photo of my eye afterward. Johnson says, who took you to the doctor? Cassie says, D-ROC. Johnson says, did you send this photo to Sean? Cassie says, yes. And I wrote, so you can remember, I wanted him to be sorry about it, at least. Johnson says, and this photo, where were you? Cassie says, in the green room in Toronto. I put my hair over my eye. Then we went to the Hamptons. Cassie says, Sean wanted to have a freak-off in the Hamptons. We got a hotel and an escort. Johnson says, which one? Cassie says, Dave. I took GHB. I went into a, quote, G-hole and blacked out. I woke up nude in the shower. Dave and Sean were freaking out. I bugged out. It wasn't pretty. Johnson says, then what? Cassie says, I spoke to a friend of Sean's, and then we continued the freak-off. Johnson says, what is this? Cassie says, my eyebrow. It's healed up a little bit. A week later, I have a permanent scar on my eyebrow. Johnson says, what is this? Cassie says, me at the Canes Festival. Johnson says, what happened at Canes? Cassie says, Sean accused me of taking drugs from his boat. He threw me off, but my passport was still on the boat. Johnson says, and you were on the red carpet that same night. Cassie says, yes. Johnson says, did you attend the movie? Cassie says, yes. Johnson says, how did you get back to New York? Cassie says, on a commercial flight. I traded my seat to get away, but he traded his seat to get next to me. Johnson says, what did he show you? Cassie says, freak-off videos. He played them for me on one of his laptops. He said he would release them. Johnson says, how did you feel? Cassie says, trapped. Johnson says, when you landed in New York, what did you do? Cassie says, we went to a dinner. Then he wanted to have a freak off. So we had a freak off. Johnson says, why did you do it? Cassie says, to make him not threaten me. Johnson says, let's read these from June 13, 2013. Had Sean been violent with you before this? Cassie says, yes. Johnson says, you had told him before you didn't want to do freak-offs. Cassie says, yes. Johnson says, you said you needed GHB. Cassie says, yes, and that 2 escorts not available. Cassie says, I wrote only Paul available or Jake the white guy, but he can't do it until 11. The other guy can do it earlier. It's just one more person knowing our secret. Johnson says, what did you mean? Cassie says, the freak-offs. Johnson says, what is SLS? Cassie says, a hotel in Hollywood. Johnson says, when would you take Valium before a freak-off? Cassie says, when I had anxiety. Sean's driver was bringing me the Valium. It was Raheem, I think. The judge says, jurors, you can take lunch now. The jurors leave. The judge says, Miss Slavic, are there still disagreements on the exhibits? Slavic says yes. The defense wants the exhibit to be longer and about Master... Yeah. The defense says they wanted to cut it off at looking at my iPad. The defense says we just heard this morning about videos on his devices, so this is relevant. Slavic says we can agree to more, something less than the 10 pages. Then Heckerfink, the lawyer for the witness known as Mia, says there is a jury instruction about victims. Heckerfink says Mia would have taken this to her grave. I don't know how to support her if we can't discuss her pain, what she went through. We will not put words in her mouth. Her nerves are through the roof. The judge says we are trying to prevent witnesses being counseled on how to testify, what to say or not to say. Anything else? Okay. Would that be acceptable? Heckerfink says I'm afraid she'll have a moment, lose it, then ask me, did I forget something? I worry. Then a lawyer for Jane Doe says, I am worried that Jane Doe will not know what she can ask me. The judge says, as long as you don't coach testimony. Then Cassie's lawyer, Douglas Wigdor, says, I have nothing to add. Then the judge says, Ms. Shapiro, we have spoken with each attorney. Then the prosecutor says, we need more time to print the binders. The judge says, we'll break. And then they went on a break. And then they came back late at 1:53 p.m. Eastern. All rise. The judge says, as to Exhibit 619, the objection to the defendant's proposal is overruled. Let's have Ms. Ventura back. Then we'll bring in our jury. The jury entered. Johnson says, I have a binder for the court. The gallery will not be able to see these exhibits. Ms. Ventura, I will show you some exhibits. 2A-404, who is it? Cassie says she worked for Sean. Johnson says we will call her Mia. When you gave your devices to the government, were they working? Cassie says no, they were broken. Johnson says put up 602-A for Ms. Ventura and the jury only. What's on your skin? Cassie says oil. Johnson says, when did Sean first hurt you physically? Cassie says it started in the first year. Johnson says, what staffer were present when Sean was physical with you? The defense says objection, physical is vague. Johnson says punching, hitting. Johnson says, when did Sean first use violence on you? Cassie says, in New York City, we were in a car with his security and he knocked me around. Johnson says, what did he do? Cassie says, he hit me in the side of the head. I fell to the floor of his Escalade. Johnson says, in January 2009, did you attend an event in LA with Sean? Cassie says, yes. Johnson says, what happened as you left? Cassie says, I had been speaking to a producer about music. Sean called me a slut. I hit him in the face. I had been drinking. Johnson says, did you see any injuries? Cassie says, no. I was on the floor of the car and he stomped on my face. Johnson says, how long did this last? Cassie says, 10 minutes. Then I tried to get away, but Sean's security brought me back. Johnson says, who? Cassie says, Roger Bonds. Johnson says, what did they tell you? Cassie says, to go to a hotel. Cassie says, they snuck me into the hotel, covered up, so no one could see my face. Johnson says, how long were you at the London hotel? Cassie says, a week, a little more. An assistant brought me ice cream. Johnson says, what was the assistant's name? Cassie says, Genevieve. Johnson says, did you feel you could leave the London hotel? Cassie says, no. I understood his capability, his access to guns, the threats he made. Johnson says, when you were taken to the hotel after the assault? Cassie says, no. Johnson says, did you know that this assault incident was reported? Cassie says, I know there was a blind item on the internet without our names. Johnson says, who raised the blind item to you? Cassie says, my mother. The defense team says, objection. Johnson says, not for the truth. The judge says, overruled. Cassie says, this was before FaceTime was very popular, so I could hide myself. She asks if it was me. Johnson says, what did you say? Cassie says, no, I did not want my mother to know something of that magnitude and be in danger. Johnson says, when you went to a party with your girlfriends, what happened? Cassie says, I saw executives from BET, then I heard that Sean was there. Johnson says, what did you do? Cassie says, I left. I ran out as fast as I could. Johnson says, why? Cassie says, I thought he was angry. Johnson says, did he came to the hotel where you were staying? Cassie says, yes. He beat me up and called me names. My face was bruised. Johnson says, this photo, who is it? Cassie says, it's Scott Mescudi, known as Kid Cudi. We did it in 2011. Johnson says, did Sean find out? Cassie says, yes, in my phone. Cassie says, Sean went through my phone doing a freak off. He found an email. Johnson says, about what? Cassie says, taking my toiletry back to Scott's the next day. Sean put a wine opener in his hand and threatened me. I called Scott, a.k.a. Kid Cudi, on a burner phone. Johnson says, where did you go? Cassie says, to Scott's house. Then I talked with Capricorn Clark, one of Sean's assistants. Johnson says, then what? Cassie says, I went to the house Sean was staying at. He told me he would release video and hurt Scott and I. Johnson says, what videos? Cassie says, freak-off videos of me. Cassie says, Sean kicked me in the back. I got a bruise. Johnson says, where did you go? Cassie says, to my hotel with the burner phone. The room was torn up. Someone peed all over the floor, pooped in the toilet, and didn't flush it. It was gross. This was just before Christmas. Cassie says, I sent an email to my mom in Capricorn from my flight to Boston and Connecticut. Johnson says, what did you write? Cassie says that Sean said he would release the tape of me on Christmas and he'd have Scott and I hurt. He said he would be out of the country then. Johnson says, what are these photographs? Cassie says, my mother took them in Connecticut of the bruises on my back. Johnson says, were you entirely honest with your mother about the abuse? Cassie says, no. I said this was the first time. Johnson says, did you tell her about the freak-offs? Cassie says, no. They took a break and then they came back at 3:09 p.m. Eastern. The judge says, Ms. Johnson, any estimate? Johnson says, an hour more. The goal is to finish the direct and allow the start of cross-examination today. The judge says, bring the witness and then the jury back in. The jury enters. Johnson says, did anyone come to see you in Connecticut? Cassie says, Scott did, Kid Cudi. Scott did for a few days. I broke it off with him. It was too dangerous. The defense team says, objection. And then the judge says, overruled. Cassie says, Sean said he would hurt both of us. Johnson says, where did you go after Connecticut? Cassie says, I went to see Sean. He was in Arizona, his son college. I told my mother I was going to LA for work. Johnson says, did Sean talk about Scott's car? Cassie says, Sean said he wanted Scott's friends to see Scott's car blown up. Johnson says, what happened next? Cassie says, we met, Sean, Scott, and me. Scott said, what about my vehicle? And Sean said, what vehicle? And that was the end of the meeting. Johnson says, put up the photo. What is this? Cassie says, me and Sean in Kingston, Jamaica for sound clash. Johnson says, were you bruised? Cassie says, yes. Johnson says, in this photo, what is it? Cassie says, me in Sean's bathroom, September 18, 2015. Johnson says, what were you doing there? Cassie says, recuperating from being beaten up by Sean in Las Vegas. Cassie says, we were having an after party in our suite. I talked to a producer and Sean tapped me on the shoulder, called me into a room and beat me. Kicked me as I tried to hide behind the toilet. Johnson says, what stopped it? Cassie says, D-ROC and Jim's Cruz came in. Cassie says, it made D-ROC sad. Johnson says, what are these communications? Cassie says, it's from D-ROC to me. He says, it's time to put ice on your face. Johnson says, why? Cassie says, I had just been beaten up by Sean. Johnson says, were these all the times he beat you? Cassie says, no, there were more. Johnson says, with who else did you see Sean be violent? Cassie says, I saw him drag an assistant out of bed. I saw him punch Eli in his head. One time in Turks and Caicos, he dragged a person. Cassie says, I believe we had a freak-off in Turks and Caicos. Johnson says, what floor did you live on in 875 Comstock? Cassie says, 17th floor. Johnson says, did a friend stay with you? Cassie says, yes. Sean came and held her and threw her on the patio furniture out on the balcony. Cassie says, I saw Sean bring her back in from over the balcony, then throw her on the patio furniture. Johnson says, and Carrie Morgan, who was Cassie's best friend at the time. Cassie says, I saw Sean hit her in the head. Johnson says, did you get drugs on your own? Cassie says, occasional drug dealers, opiates, Xanax, Valium. Cassie says Sean would put the pills in a vitamin C bottle on the sink in the New York apartment. He would say, you can take them. He had doctors who would write the prescriptions in the name of an assistant or in my name. Johnson says, your brother's birthday party in Connecticut in 2013, what happened? Cassie says, my mother told me someone was taking pictures of me. I went and punched her in the head. Johnson says, you testify your relationship with Sean ended in 2018. How was your health? Cassie says, I was sleepwalking. I had PTSD. The defense says objection. The judge says overruled. Johnson says, what is this? Cassie says, a photo of my front door in 2018. Johnson says, publish it to the jury. Why is there a knife there? Cassie says, Sean was coming around a lot, so I had it. Johnson says, August 2018, what happened? Cassie says, we were having a closure conversation at a restaurant in Malibu. He was trying to convince me to go to Burning Man. Johnson says, were you seeing anyone? Cassie says, my now husband. Johnson says, what happened next? Cassie says, Sean came to my house and raped me on my living room floor. It was like taking something from you. Johnson says, you cried. What did Sean do? Cassie says, he continued and finished inside of me. Then he got up and left. Johnson says, did you ever have sex with him again? Cassie says, yes, voluntarily. We had a good night. I went back to his house. Johnson says, can you explain why did you do that after he raped you? Cassie says, we had been together 10 years. Johnson says, who did you stay in touch with? Cassie says, most people, though I pulled away. Cassie says, what did you message Sean about after that? Cassie says, just checking in. Johnson says, what did he send you? Cassie says that he had iPads full of images, get him his money. Johnson says, money back for what? Cassie says, for having paid my now husband to be my trainer. Johnson says, what did you write back? Cassie says, do you want me to tell the truth? It's much deeper than iPads. There was abuse, more than freak-offs. Cassie says, there was a time I couldn't take the pain. Tried to walk out in traffic. My husband wouldn't let me. I had trauma therapy. Johnson says, did you write? Cassie says, a book with chapters. My mother helped me. Johnson says, what did you want with the book? Cassie says, I wanted Sean to read it. Johnson says, what pain did Sean put you through? Cassie says, shame. To carry the things that were shameful for him. I took on a lot of responsibility for that I never should have. He brought the concept to me when I was 22. It was expected of me. I felt terrible. Johnson says, how did you get chapters to Sean? Cassie says, through my attorney. And I reached out to KK. I asked her if he read it. She said it was not taken seriously. Johnson says, how much did you ask for the book? Cassie says, $30 million. Johnson says, did you sue? Cassie says, yes, November 2023. Johnson says, what happened with the lawsuit? Cassie says, it's settled for $20 million in 24 hours. Johnson says, why are you testifying in this trial? Cassie says, I can't carry this anymore. What's wrong is wrong. You treat people like they were disposable. Escorts, anybody. Johnson says, how many freak-offs did you have with Sean? Cassie says, impossible to know. Hundreds. Johnson says, after you broke up with Sean, did you ever do a freak-off? Cassie says, no. Then Johnson says, no further questions. So they made the jury leave. Then the judge says, why don't we put off the cross-examination until tomorrow? Johnson says, we would like to start now to be sure to finish. The judge says, Miss Estavajo? Then Miss Estavajo says, I will be finished by the end of the week. Then the judge says, so no cross-examination today. The judge says, we'll just make up the time in other ways. Get the jury. Johnson says, the witness can be excused. The judge says, yes. The jury entered. The judge says, sorry to bring you out only to send you home. Don't read anything about this case. Have a great evening. All rise. Then the jury left. All right, you guys, so that was all. That's what happened today in day 2 of Cassie's testimony. And tomorrow, they are going to cross-examine her. So, yeah, stay tuned for that. I will have the transcript. It's going to be, oh, my gosh, poor Cassie. And she's 9 months pregnant. She is due in the beginning of June or the end of May. I forgot which, but yeah, she's due in a few weeks. So yeah. You guys, thank you for tuning in. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on that notification so you don't miss any updates, okay? Because they are gonna come. I'm gonna bring you all the updates. All right, thanks for tuning in, and I will see you on the next one. Peace.